Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Services Ops podcast presented by Provis, the best podcast solely dedicated to the people, processes, and technology of running a good services organization. My name is Chris Souza. I'm head of marketing at Provis, here, as always, with our co-host, co-founder, services luminary, genius, one of a kind, Mahesh Bakshi. How you doing, Mahesh?
Doing wonderful, Chris. Thank you so much. This is a wonderful afternoon here and excited to chat with our guest today. He's a special guest.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's introduce our great guest. So we have with us today Mitchell Palsson, Director of Professional Services Operations with CentralSquare, and he also offers high quality, highly recommended quality PS content through PSAmplify. We will definitely link to his LinkedIn and the website and the follow-up with this episode. But Mitchell, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me, and you're too kind. I appreciate it.
Of course. So let's just get straight into it. Mitchell, before we kind of get into our topic of the day, which we talked about connecting the business to services, or more importantly, connecting the services mind frame to the business. Before we get into that, let's talk about you, right? Talk a little bit about yourself, your role, how you kind of got into your love and advocacy for professional services.
Yeah, well, I think my background plays into everything that I talk about. It might surprise people, but my undergraduate degree was to become a high school history teacher. So I had no plans of going into the world of technology. I had just taken a few undergraduate business courses, thinking that I might get a minor in business. But really, my focus was on being a history teacher and working with high school students. As I went through the program, I realized that it wasn't for me, that I wanted something different with my life. And so I moved on to a master's program in learning sciences and technologies, which essentially is learning theory applied to technological environments, thinking that I'd move into the kind of ed tech space. So after that, I found that most ed tech companies are more in need of programmers than educational theorists.
Mhm.
And so I started applying just wherever I could and was lucky enough to land a role with Deloitte Consulting, working on their consulting side with large ERP implementations for Fortune 500 companies, federal agencies, state governments, things like that. And so I was able to come on as an instructional designer to use my educational background. And then throughout my career, I shifted from instructional designer to functional consultant to PMO manager. I've served as chief of staff to a CEO of our company, and currently am, like you said, director of professional services operations. And so I think initially I thought that I was pretty unique in that most people in a technology company are going to have either a business background or a technology background. But as I've met more and more people and have worked with people, I think that more often than not, you're finding people who have transitioned careers and are not coming in with that really strong background, from a bachelor's degree or a master's degree, and they're kind of learning as they go, just like I did.
Yeah, and that's a very highly relevant message, I think, for anybody in charge of operational decisions, right? Like not very often do you say, I'm going to get really good at operating one specific business. I'm going to plan my whole way to be like, it just doesn't happen that way. You kind of like you have a skill and a talent and you just kind of find yourself there. So that's super interesting.
And,
Um,
and to add to that, Mitch, I think while it's you thought it was unique and you found more and more people with that kind of background, but I think what it does as well is really bring a different kind of thought process into technology-led innovation, or how we apply technology to different businesses. Like I have what I call the most typical background, right? I mean, I went to computer engineering. I did my bachelor's there. Then I did programming. From programming, I went to engagement management, program management, project management. From there, I went into leading organizations. It's like the most typical background that you can find in the computer industry. But something like what you have done, I think it really brings different flavors, different experience, different thinking process, which is what I think is needed to really drive these projects differently.
Agreed. Though I do wish I had some of that background at times. So I think there's, yeah, like you said, value to all different flavors.
Yeah.
all right, well, let's get in kind of the topic of the day. Mitchell, last time we spoke, I asked what was on your mind, and you were talking a lot about connecting the services organization to the business as a value add and a strategic add, and also tactically. So I'd love to get, why don't you kind of explain a little bit what you mean by connecting the services organization to the business?
Yeah. Well, just to kind of continue on with my story of my own background and experience, I found that as I was moving up into higher and higher profile roles, that different things were being asked of me than when I was an individual contributor. And so I was all of a sudden in calls and meetings with people from FP&A or from sales or from product. And the conversations were, you know, referencing terms or acronyms, on the finance and business side that I wasn't familiar with. So I realized that, hey, I need to get up to speed. I need to brush up on my business acumen and make sure that I'm aware of what's being discussed and that I can contribute intelligently, which I think is a big miss in the world of professional services. Because as a consultant, you're so focused on just delivering your solution. You're working with your customer, you're just heads down, working on the next task, billing the next hour, and rarely are you stepping back and taking a look at the larger picture and really understanding what's going on. Just for example, as a consultant, I thought time cards were used to like control me and to monitor me and make sure that I was doing what I was supposed to be doing. I had no understanding that they were being used to determine, revenue POC on a project or being used to invoice the customer. That's something, pretty basic. But if you can connect that consultant's daily work to the broader business and help them understand, hey, you're not just working an hour, you're helping us to recognize revenue and you're helping us to invoice the customer, they'll probably be less likely to have a late time card because now they understand their impact on the business, even though it may be small in that area, but they have a little bit more, ownership and they're understanding, hey, all of this aggregates up to me hitting my goals, my bonuses. So I'm going to pay a little bit more attention to it than I have been to this point.
Yeah, that's and how do you go about? I think it's a great example. The time card thing is a great example. Um, what levels of education, or how do you go about educating the services organization to say like, hey, this is important and this is why? And then how do you take them one step even higher to talk about like profitability matters, like your performance impacts profitability. So it's not just about billing, it's not just about this, it's about the business in general. Like, how do you do that? Do you put it in systematically through trainings or technology? Like, what's your approach?
Yeah. So when you talk about like the three people, process, and technology,
Mhm.
I think when it comes to people, you do need to have concerted trainings around these topics. I think a lot of managers, well, first, I think a lot of leaders forget that not everyone knows what they know. That, the things you've learned 10, 20 years ago are brand new to someone who's just starting now, or maybe who has never heard it. And so you do have to go back to the basics. I had a LinkedIn post last week where I talked about Vince Lombardi and how every season he would start by saying, this is a football and helping people, remember, these are the fundamentals, these are the basics of the business. You would think, why would an NFL player need to be told what a football is? But it just kind of instills a culture of we're focused on the fundamentals and we're going to make sure that everyone is on the same page. And so I think as leaders, we need to make time and cover some of these topics. What is revenue recognition? What are billing milestones? How do we forecast off of these things? If the data is bad, how does that impact our AOP? And if our AOP is bad, how does that impact, our bonuses and our, productivity? And so there's a lot of ways that you as a manager can kind of address some of these topics either in weekly team meetings or, when you're meeting with someone and let's say their billing milestone target dates are all in the past, you just remind them, hey, it's not just important to update them, but the reason why we're updating these is so that we can forecast cash flow and see when these things are going to be invoiced. So just, taking the time to remind the resources of not only to do the task that you're asking them to do, but also to tie it into why it's important. When I think of processes, I think of how managers are leading their team meetings. Different companies approach it in different ways. I prefer to have a little bit more of a structured, hey, take your time to do your team meeting, but let's also make sure that we're hitting on these topics so that at each level we're reviewing these things and the message is getting out there. Technology, again, like if you're looking at a PSA, you want to make sure that it's baked into the system and that it's relevant and that it's apparent to everyone what they need to do, and they're seeing that data. So if you're talking about billing milestones and there's a workspace for them to be in, make sure that those are there front and center and that they can see how many are coming up in the next 30 days, how many are overdue, or how many may need to be rescheduled based of the Gantt shifting, things like that. So really try to operationalize it within the system. And then, tied to dashboards that are relevant. I think, it's easy to get into the proliferation of dashboards and like there's just dozens and dozens and you don't know which one to refer to. But you should have a core set of dashboards that are kind of the single source of the truth, where you're really like, this is what we're looking at, and everyone needs to be looking at it at their own level so that we're all on the same page and working towards the same goal.
Yeah, that is extremely well said, Mitch. And if you think of the services, right, whether it's a product company, consulting company, professional services company, no matter what kind of services you provide, services is more complex than delivering a product of any kind, because when you are delivering services, you are dealing with technology, yes, but you are dealing with people and processes, most importantly. And it makes, and because your services engagements can be fixed bid for fixed scope, different, maybe even if it's T&M, there is a scope associated with it, there are milestone billing, and you have to be aware of all of those things. It's a fine intersection of people like us who are super passionate about solving a complex problem for the customers, but you don't have an infinite time. You don't have, you cannot take as much time as you need because there's a SOW associated with it. There's a cost associated with it. There's a P&L associated with it. So how do you finally balance what you want to do for the customer, which is make the customer successful and solve a complex business problem, and yet make your employer or this engagement profitable, because that's what the companies work for. That's how they survive. That's how they thrive. And, I found, one of the best practices that we learned and started doing in one of the companies that I worked previously is, before even kickoff, once you have identified the team, do a joint reading of the SOW together. Because there are so many finer details in the SOW, like what kind of billing is this? Why timesheets are important? Because, hey, at the end of every Friday, we need to do an invoice. Why this understanding of the scope is so important, right? Who are the key players and what is important to them? Because you can't get kind of dragged away by, maybe someone who is a loudmouth or someone who has a higher influence, but that doesn't mean that the other groups are not important for the project delivery. So there's just so many components, so many different elements that play to the success of what you are supposed to deliver. And like you said, it's, maybe half of the room has been doing it for 10 years or 20 years, but what about the other half? They don't know how complex undertaking this one is. And so very well put in terms of really, bringing everybody together and start like from ground zero, if you will.
Yeah, I think those are great additions. And like you said, even just with contracts, you would assume if you hire a project manager that they're comfortable and confident in reading a contract. You might be surprised that that's not always what happens. And so again, that's just one of the fundamentals that you have to drill is, when we book an opportunity, the first thing you need to do is go in and review the contract, make sure that the template, because PSAs probably have a template that's maybe derived from their scoping. But are you applying a template that is in alignment with the SOW and the contract? If not, you can get off on the wrong foot right out of the gate. And it sets you back, and all of a sudden you're apologizing to the customer instead of having a great start.
Yeah. And Mitch, I've spent 30 years in this industry, and most of that solving a complex business problems for the customers. As much as passionate I am for solving complex business problems for the customers, most often than not, people don't pay attention to how you are drafting your SOW, how you are estimating, how you are doing the quoting, what are the things that you are just giving away without really documenting. Because the last thing customers and you want is in the kickoff, at the end of the kickoff, you talk to the customer and say, by the way, here is a change order, right? Nobody wants to hear that. Nobody wants to really get that at the end of your kickoff and like, why didn't you tell me before? Why wasn't the scope clear? I told everything to, that I knew of. Why didn't you document it? Or why didn't you, explain it to your team and all that kind of stuff? So, and this is where, Provus, I mean, we don't want to get into the history of Provus here, why we started, but this is one of the key aspect of why we started Provus, which where we automate that entire services quoting or services CPQ process, so that while you want to deliver and you are delivering to the best of your abilities, but how you are scoping, how you are estimating, how you are quoting, how your T's and C's, your scope elements, all of that gets into the document is something that we focus on as part of our software.
That was one of my kind of first forays into the world of operations was when I was a functional consultant. My manager asked me to help productize the service for our new product that we had, I think, around 15 live customers. And so I went through and did a lot of the documentation, standardization. How do we productize this so that we can turn around and scope it accurately and then repeatedly without having to tap on services resources, hey, should we do this or do that? So I think that's one area that is massively underserved, where services teams aren't reviewing their implementation methodology frequently enough and looking at the data associated with it to then have that positive feedback loop of, are we updating our scoping so that we're constantly having the best available data coming into us?
Right.
And who do you think, where does the buck stop there, right? With the focus on data and looking more into the future or on the past, right? With those services teams that you're talking about, like, is it managers? Is it CROs, CFOs? Like where should it start, and who's kind of dropping the ball when you're not having those types of reviews?
Well, I'm all for services owning its own destiny and keeping services within services. So I would hate for the CFO or CRO or someone else to come and tell us that our data is bad.
Mm-hmm.
So that was one of the first things when I came into this role. So I had been involved from a transformation director perspective in helping to implement our PSA. And then I went for 9 months and was working as the chief of staff to the CEO. And then I came back as the director of professional services operation and was looking at the data in the system. And it felt like I had handed the keys to a Ferrari to my 15-year-old son. And like, it was just wrecked because there were thousands of hours of time cards that had not been submitted or approved. There were millions of dollars of billing milestones with target dates in the past, so you couldn't forecast them. And so for me, that was one of my first real efforts, was to clean up the data and then instill kind of the discipline around dashboards and reminders. Because I mean, humans aren't computers. We're not meant to be processing, thousands of lines of data and understanding what's going in the system. So you'd have to kind of create those processes so that people know where to turn. But as a director of professional services operations, I don't have time to be cleaning up everyone's data every week. So we really need to drive that down into the business and help the managers and ultimately the individual contributors understand why it's important. And again, instill those habits so that they are the ones who are maintaining it. And we're just kind of the backstop that's making sure it doesn't get too out of control, and back in a bad spot.
And please, a question for Mahesh and for you, Mitchell. The data being so important, you got lots of people that you need to have doing the right things so that the data is clean. How do you work with, and let's go back to that C-level, right? So what is your pitch from your operational seat to the CEO? What is your pitch to the CFO to invest in your data quality within your services organization? Whether, once again, it's either technology or it's process, but what do you go to those folks? It all starts at the top, right? Like you can we can map it out the best we want, but unless the buy-in is where it is, both financially and prioritization, it's probably going to get stalled. So what's your pitch to kind of those two departments, right? Your C-level, your finance folks, and then your strategic folks.
I would say, I mean, if you want to have realistic and attainable targets that the company is working towards, it all starts with accurate data. I mean, you cannot operate on faulty data. Otherwise, you're just kind of throwing spaghetti against the wall and hoping to see what sticks. And so really, I would hope that, you know, your C-suite and your strategy arm will understand that, you know, your inputs or your outputs only equal your inputs, right? And so if you have bad inputs, you're going to have bad outputs, and you're going to set yourself back from the start. So let's invest in, you know, the systems and the processes and the people to make sure that they have the data. Because, you know, having been in, you know, these calls with the executives, again, this was an eye-opening thing for me. It's all about the data. You know, it's all about the numbers. It's all about the forecasts. It's all about drilling in to see what can we pull forward. And if it's not accurately forecasted, you don't know what you can pull forward because you don't even know where it stands. And so you really need to have that foundation if the business is going to thrive.
Yeah, and I think completely agree, Mitch. My experience has been that you know, this particular piece is easy to sell to the executives because there's a concept, you know, everyone understands the concept of DSO, which is days sales outstanding. In other words, if your invoices are inaccurate or delayed, the amount of time that it's going to take for you to receive the payment is going to be delayed. And every day of that delay is going to cause not just disruptions, but it's going to cost to someone for running the operations, right? And so I think, you know, I believe that's an easy one to sell because ultimately the entire business runs on the kinds of projects, the timesheets, milestone-based billing, and doing those accurately on time, right? Both are important. On time is important and accuracy is important because if you do it on time and then after 3 days somebody comes and says, "Oh, sorry, I forgot my timesheet. You know, here is the one," and then you have to redo the invoice. The clock is just resetting every time. Or if customer comes back and says, "Oh, you didn't charge for this correctly," the counter resets every time you are doing inaccurate invoicing, right? So I think it's an easy sell. Everyone understands the importance of data. Where it's important is really for people on the ground to really understand why you are creating a bigger impact for the company that you are working for and for the customers, but to run the operations of the company successfully, these other things that may be boring to you to do it on Friday evening called timesheet, you know, here is why it's so critical to do it and take that 15 minutes, half an hour, whatever time you need on a Friday evening, right? I think that's the key. And I love what Mitch said earlier. I think just treat every project beginning as if everyone is hearing or doing it for the first time. Just talk about the basics, talk about, you know, the type of project, why timesheets, what is timesheets, all of that stuff. I think that's a great advice.
Yeah. And I think one of the worst habits that a leader can get into is trying to own it themselves and saying, like, I'm just going to make sure that my org's data is clean, because again, they don't have the time to do that. They should be monitoring it and they should be ensuring that it's, you know, up to date and accurate. But you're going to be spending your time in the wrong area if you're trying to be the hero who's just doing it all, instead of, you know, training and trusting and then verifying along the way.
Absolutely.
And then, of course, as you know, let's put all our technologists operational hats on, really configuring and making sure that your PSA, your CRM, they're doing what they do with guardrails as much as possible. Right? You want to make sure that's a nice wide river so people can execute well, but there's definitely a stopping point. And when it comes to collecting data, personally, that's where I like to narrow the riverbanks a little bit. Like there's how you execute, and then there's the data that you contribute to the overall business and your processes. And so when I think about guardrails and actually collecting data, I like to narrow it a little bit more. Still let execution happen the way it happens, right? But you know.
Well, yeah, I mean, just going back to when I first stepped into this role and was reviewing the data within our PSA, I found that there were over $2 million in billing milestones that had been approved, but not put into a a billing event. So within the system, the PM had to approve it and then go back to the project and then generate a billing event.
Mm.
And they were forgetting to do that second part. And
Wow.
nothing in the system was telling you that you needed to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
So, don't just trust your system that it's set up correctly. Like,
Yeah.
again, trust but verify. And then if it's not, you need to make a change, which is what we did. We said, okay, once the PM approves, every night we're going to have an automation that sweeps everything into a billing event so that we don't get into this situation again.
Wow.
Love that. Love that. So good. All right, so we're just about at the end of our time. Mitchell, the way we like to end our episodes here is everybody just takes one crack at probably one solid foundational takeaway for our audience. You either challenge them to do this week or do a little bit later. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump in with one that you guys both kind of inspired me on, and then we'll kind of go around the horn and go to you. So one thing I think is really important takeaway based off of this conversation is educating your entire services business line about the business. And an outcome from that you're going to get more likely than not is you get boots on the ground, right? The people who live the inefficiencies in the process every single day, now thinking about making those better, right? Like Mitchell said, you're in this tunnel and you're just trying to finish a project. If you're thinking about the profitability of your project, if you're thinking about your billing hours or whatever it's going to be, even though it's not your job, you're more likely than not opening lots of the actual boots on the ground's eyes who are going to come to you with suggestions and come to you with ideas on how to improve those. And that's the best way you're going to do it, right? Like we can always sit up on top of the tower for a while and come up with ideas, but it's best heard from the ground up, right? So I'm just echoing probably what was Mitchell's advice, but I just thought that was really good. All right, Mahesh, you're up.
Yeah. I'm going to go one step up in the process food chain and take this opportunity to obviously talk about ProOS. But more often than not, the services, and I'm talking about B2B services, because B2C, if you're something like Apple, you don't need a whole lot of services, right? But if you're B2B, no matter what kind of technology you have, there's going to be people and process that's involved. And more often than not, you end up in a stressful situation, change order situations, customer being unhappy, team being stressed out. All of those situations arise because the upfront process of estimation, quoting, SOW, thinking through all of the clauses, thinking through the scope elements, what should be in the scope, what should be out of the scope, what is it that the customer should be doing, right? All of those things you leave somewhat ambiguous for someone to interpret. And when it's ambiguous for someone to interpret, customer always wins, right? You don't win. So I would say, if you have not automated your services CPQ or services quoting process, which allows you to do your estimations and quoting accurately, timely, allows you to learn from your previous, quoting, how you have sold, how you have executed. I think this is the time to really, take this opportunity and really implement that upfront process, which is obviously going to feed into your backend fulfillment systems as well. But it's going to make everyone's life so much simpler, so much smoother, and most importantly, your customers are going to be super happy in terms of how you are doing the proposal making in the first place.
Excellent. All right, Mitchell, take us away with your great takeaway.
Well, I'm just going to piggyback on what Mahesh was saying earlier and say that if you're a leader in professional services and you want to improve your team's business acumen, but you don't know where to start, just pull up a recent contract and start working through that with your team and dissecting it and then asking them questions. What do these terms mean? What do these conditions mean? What do these milestone payments mean? And trying to explain it to them and then tying it to the work that they do so that they understand their involvement in the broader business. I think that's a fantastic way to start.
Awesome. And of course, visit Mitchell's LinkedIn and PSAmplify and refer all your teams to kind of learn from what's going on there as well, obviously.
Yeah,
please do. Takeaway. Awesome, Mitchell. Thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun. Really, really enlightening conversation. Great way to start a week. And thank you to our audience for listening. Please like, subscribe, share. Like we said, we've got great tips at the end of this episode. Forward them to your colleagues and go out and be an excellent services leader.